Dear students, we will be talking about the profile of elderly in India in this module. The elderly, in which situations they are living, their living conditions, the socio-economic profile, their health conditions and their living arrangements. These are all certain important things which we need to know as part of the profile of the elderly, because it is very important to plan suitable policies and programs based on the profile of them. Unless we know the existing living conditions and also their socio-economic status, it will be insufficient to have necessary data for them to build on the suitable policies and programs. In this context, we need to understand the various aspects like their demographic situation, the socio-economic status, the work and income status, the living arrangements, familial relations, their subjective well-being, functionality and healthcare utilization. These are all very essential domains and various dimensions of profile of them. In this context, it is very essential for us to know that what are the sources through which we can understand these profiles. Sources like national level surveys, like population census, National Sample Survey Organization's data and various other macro level data constitute secondary data for us to understand the profile of the elderly. Similarly, a large scale surveys carried out by different national and international bodies at different points of time also constitutes a major data source for us to understand these issues. In this context, we will be focusing on these various socio-economic, demographic, cultural and health aspects of elderly population with reference to India based on population census and also the latest survey carried out as part of building knowledge base on population aging in India, sponsored by United Nations Population Fund, New Delhi. This is one of the collaborative efforts of three institutions: International Indian Institute of Social and Economic Change, Bangalore; Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai; and Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. The three organizations have come together, constituted a committee and worked out for a long-term projects on various issues related to population aging in India. As part of it, the large-scale study was carried out and the findings are going to be presented in this module. When we talk about the profile of elderly, we need to know that population census is a major source of information. As part of other age groups, the elderly population of 60 plus is also provided the various aspects related to their living conditions. For instance, when we talk about census, the latest census of 2011, if we see, there is a different characteristics of elderly population we can understand from this source. In this context, we need to start with what is the population size of 60 plus elderly population in India. As high as 104.2 million is enrolled as a 60 plus age group as per 2011 census, which is a percent of 8.6% in the total population. In the sense, for every 100, there will be on an average 8.6 are 60 plus age group. What is its decadal growth rate? When we compare with the 2001 census, last census period to this census period, the growth rate for the last 10 years among 60 plus is as high as 35.2%. What this clearly indicates is that the population aging phenomena is very high and it is further accelerated at every census period. The growth rate clearly indicates that the growth rate of 35.2 now is almost double the general population growth that is experienced across all age groups in India. That shows that the acceleration of population aging is at very high level in India, and the efforts are to be taken on a priority basis to address various issues in focusing on aging issues. Similarly, the census data also gives us to know what is the old age dependency ratio. Old age dependency ratio is the number of 60 plus per 100 persons in the working age group, that is 15 to 59 age group. If you take this ratio, then you will get a old age dependency ratio. The old age dependency ratio based on the 2011 census indicates it is as high as 14.2%, which is a significant improvement from the increase in the percentage when you talk about the comparison between two censuses. The other aspect which we need to understand is as a part of social development, what is the literacy rate among 60 plus. It is very important that we know that the literacy rate, when you are talking about 60 plus, 60 years back they were born, and there over a period the literacy rate as though in the present generations we are able to achieve very high literacy rate, but there being representing from the older age group, the percent of literacy is very low among them. So, the literacy rate as per 2011 census is to the extent of 43.5%. Furthermore, gender differences, which we are going to touch upon later, you will come to know the huge variations between male and female elderly population even in literacy and also the other socio-economic indicators. What is the percent of non-worker percentage among 60 plus age group, which is as high as 58.6%. This is a very huge number. Now, coming back to the social component, the other aspect is marital status. As you all know that marital status, given the universalization of marriage and also given the various issues related to the widowhood, it is very important for us to know what proportion of elderly are experiencing widowhood or they are continue to be in a single or never married. Marital status, for example, when we talk about 2011 census, the proportion no doubt of 2/3, that is 65.5% are currently married. That means a large volume of elderly still they are married and currently they are with their spouses. But one of the important alarming issue is gender differences. Again, for instance, when you talk about widowhood especially among females is very, very high. The reasons for all those issues we are going to discuss. There is an increasing trend in the case of divorced or separated, though they constitute very, very negligible at this stage. Thus, marital status is one of the important social dimensions in which we have to assess, because with widowhood, especially women elderly will experience a lot of vulnerability issues. They will become further marginalized and isolated from the family as well as from the neighborhood. In that context, we need to know what are their living conditions, what are the ways their needs can be addressed is a huge challenge for planning and also policy point of view. Given the rural-urban differences, another dimension is what percent of elderly are living in rural areas. Rural-dominated society like India, elderly are not exceptional, and furthermore, most of them they are residing as high as 71% of our total elderly in India, they are all based in rural areas. So, this huge number, especially the characteristics of rural is that they are devoid of infrastructure facilities, access to health is an issue, infrastructural issues are there, electricity is an issue, and furthermore, the geography in which they are living is also add to the problems in which the rural elderly issues can be addressed to a reasonable. That is why it is a huge dimension and also challenge for us how to reach out with the suitable programs and schemes so as to see that they really touch upon those elderly who are in rural areas, so that their quality of life can be addressed with suitable programs and schemes. Another dimension which we need to understand as part of the profile of the elderly is sex ratio. As we have observed earlier also, that sex ratio gives the gender balance that exists or imbalance that exists in our society. It is usually calculated as number of females per 1000 males. It is very significant to know that while sex ratio among general population is not in favor of girls at younger ages, it is just opposite in the case of elderly. What it indicates clearly is, for instance, sex ratio among 60 plus is as high as 1033. That indicates for every 1000 men elderly, there are 1033 female elderly. That clearly shows that feminization of aging is currently experienced in the countries like India, and it is universally seen. What clearly shows is that the life expectancy among female elderly is relatively higher compared to male elderly. So, this is another aspect which we need to know, that feminization of aging is coming and it is increasing further and further. So, more female elderly not only coming to 60 plus age group, but given their socio-economic profile, as in the case of marital status, and also as in the case of non-worker participation, or in their high literacy rate among them, all have individually and collectively also play an important role in determining that they are experiencing a very, very high vulnerability, and in that way their low socio-economic conditions that exist among them is really alarming. This clearly shows that the percent of elderly in India has been increasing at an increasing rate in recent years, and the trend is likely to continue in the coming decades. The share of population over the age of 60 is projected to increase from 8% in 2015 to as high as 19% in 2050. By the end of this century, the elderly will constitute nearly 34% of the total population in the country. Though the growth rate of the elderly population dipped slightly in the 60s and 80s, it was always higher than the general population, and the difference between the two has widened over the period. What the demographic profile of elderly shows? The annual growth rate of elderly will be over 3% till middle of this century, indicating faster pace of growth than other age categories. On the contrary, the growth rate of younger age group is already negative in the country. Undoubtedly, therefore, relatively young India today will turn into a rapidly aging society in the coming decades. A distinguishing feature of aging in India is the significant interstate differences that is there across various states of India. Disparity in terms of both levels and growth of the elderly population, depending upon the pace of demographic transition as discussed earlier in these states, is another important thing which we need to see. India has significant inter-regional and interstate demographic diversity based on the stages of demographic transition and variations in the onset and phase of fertility transition. Consequently, there are considerable variations in the age structure of the population, including the aging experience. For instance, the southern states are the front runners in population aging, along with Himachal Pradesh, Maharashtra, Odisha and Punjab. The central and northern states such as Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and Uttarakhand have much lower proportions of elderly population. What this clearly indicates, based on 2011 census, the overall old age dependency shows that there are over 14 elderly per 100 working age population, with significant variations across states. In Kerala, Goa, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Odisha and Andhra Pradesh, the old age dependency ratio is much higher than 15, nearly 20% as in Kerala, whereas it is less than 10 in states like Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Nagaland and Chandigarh. Indicating clearly that higher old age dependency ratio reflects higher level of demand for care from immediate family. That is one of the important challenging issues that are coming given the young population through migration moving away from their family hold. The mortality experience among general population as against the elderly population contributes to the faster growth of the latter group. Again, based on the 2011 census, the overall old age dependency shows that there are over 14 elderly per 100 working age population, with significant variations that are noticed across different states. The clearly demographic profile vividly describes that at a consistent periods of time and in future also, we can see a regular increase in the proportion of elderly population, and there is a consistent decline in the childhood population, which by 2050 we are going to see a situation where the elderly population proportion is going to cross the proportion among the children, which clearly this says that population aging is here to stay. That it is not in a phased manner it is occurring, it is going to here be with us for a longer period in the society. So that is why we have to prepare ourselves how we should experience and how we should place the systems to address through suitable policies and programs to tackle these issues, so that their quality of life will be taken care of. Coming to the socio-economic profile, the profile of individual elderly indicates there exists a low level of educational attainment, particularly among women. Half of the elderly report not having any formal education, with a higher proportion, almost 2/3 noticed among women. This clearly shows that female elderly and their vulnerability because of high illiteracy is going to be a huge challenge, which has an ultimate deterrent factor in enhancing their quality of life. Around 60% of the elderly are currently married, while 38% are widowed. Widowhood is as high as 59% among the elderly women. That clearly shows that widowhood is another dimension of vulnerability in Indian society. On an average, 4 children were born to the ever married elderly woman, of whom 3.5 children are currently surviving. Almost 60% of the elderly are heads of households that they live in. The headship rate, as expected, is found to be substantially higher among elderly men as compared to elderly women. That is why invariably in most of the societies, the men are dominating in taking care of the household as head of households, and women, they play a secondary role by taking care of the domestic activities. About 78% of the sampled elderly households in their survey, they are Hindus, 9% each are Muslims and Sikhs, 21% belong to scheduled castes, 6% to scheduled tribes, and 35% to other backward classes. About 60% of elderly households reported that in the case of infrastructure in the house, piped water as the main source of drinking water, though mostly from public water tap, that is 38% depend on public piped water supply, which is the safest and secured for improving their health, as against 22% having piped water in their household premises. A much higher proportion of households in urban areas have piped waters as compared to rural areas, which clearly indicates that urban elderly have relatively advantageous condition in terms of having a proper safe drinking water in their households. Similarly, toilet facilities, they are not available to as high as 48% of households in rural areas and 12% in urban areas. As we know very well, the toilet facility is another important aspect which we need to focus for elderly people. 1/4 of the households live in kacha houses, about 1/3 in semi-pakka houses, and the rest in pakka houses. More than half of the surveyed households use wood as a cooking fuel, which also is an important aspect as a part of quality of housing. Now coming back to the economic aspects, it is very interesting that about 2/5 of the households are below poverty line, and they have a BPL card. More than 1/3 of elderly households have a monthly per capita expenditure below 1000 rupees only, and only 17% have monthly per capita expenditure as high as more than 2500 rupees. The wealth quintile calculated on the basis of asset holding and amenities within the household show that the variation in wealth across the 7 states is stark, variations. For instance, in Odisha, 60% of households belong to the lowest wealth quintile, while it is just 5% in states like Kerala, Punjab and Himachal Pradesh. Similarly, about 27% of the surveyed elderly households had an outstanding loan at the time of survey, and 13% reported that the loan is taken for meeting the medical expenditure of the elderly. That clearly suggests that around 16% of the households are receiving financial transfers from their children, relatives or other members. What about work and income status? The work participation rate among elderly males in India is as high as 39% as against only 11% among elderly women. The majority of workers are in the age group 60 to 69, but the workforce participation among oldest old, those who are above 80 years, is relatively high to the extent of 13% among men and 3% among women. More than 80% of elderly workers are main workers. Although work participation is low among women, they would certainly be contributing to the family chores, enabling the other adult members to go to work. A majority of the elderly, as high as 71%, they work due to economic necessity and not by choice. This is particularly true among women. That's why there is a close link between current work participation and poverty and illiteracy. Similarly, women living alone have a higher incidence of work participation compared to those living with spouse or others. In addition, the data highlights the unskilled and low paid nature of the jobs that the elderly are engaged in. The elderly are working primarily in the unorganized sector where both productivity and pay are low, and also in the absence of social security measures, those who are from unorganized sector, they are highly vulnerable because there is no assurance for old age pensions. The significant level of workforce participation by senior citizens is an indication of economic compulsion. Though the number of years spent in the labor force is considerable, pension or retirement benefits are not available to large majority. In fact, due to the informal nature of the work they are engaged in, less than 10% of elderly only get employer's pension. That is also to the extent of only among 3% women, and in the case of men it is 15%. As a result of being part of the labor force, nearly 3/4 of elderly men and a little less than half of the elderly women report having some type of personal income. Of them, a substantial proportion of elderly men receive income from agriculture, farm or from salary or wages. Another interesting is only about 1/3 of all elderly men receive income from either employer's pension or social pension. However, having income does not necessarily reflect the economic well-being of the elderly, especially when the income is linked to current labor force participation. Almost 3/4 of all elderly say that they are fully or partially dependent on others to meet their economic needs. Even though the income earned by the elderly is not high, over half of all elderly who report receiving personal income say that they contribute towards the household budget, with the majority of it going for daily expenditure. This implies clearly that households still depend on income of the elderly to meet their day-to-day needs such as wages as well as social pension, although meager, appear to be important for their family survival. So these are some of the important aspects which we need to know about in understanding as part of the profile of the elderly. Unless we know these aspects in which the socioeconomic conditions and also the living conditions of the elderly, we will not be able to channelize our efforts in evolving suitable policies and programs so that the access, awareness, knowledge, attitudes and utilization can be enhanced for these people so that their quality of life can be addressed thoroughly, and then harmony can prevail among all the generations that exist in the household. So to that extent, the profile of the elderly covered in this module plays a very important role in understanding the living conditions of the elderly in our society. With regard to the living arrangement and family relations, it is interesting that family has traditionally been the primary source of support for the elderly. It's a matter of concern that even with a strong preference to live with children or relatives, and not to mention high levels of economic dependency, about 1 in 10 elderly women live alone. About 80% of the elderly co-reside with their spouse and children, and in some cases with other relatives. 1/4 of all elderly receive money transfers from their non-resident children, and about 8% elderly transfers money to their children. While a majority of elderly prefer to live with their sons, a small proportion prefers to live alone or with their spouse. In effect, the family is the most preferred place to live in old age, with only 0.3% preferring to live in old age homes. This is very important that we have to understand. The vulnerability, the elderly, is reflected in the fact that 1 in 10 reports being subjected to some form of abuse. High levels of abuse are reported by the elderly living in rural areas compared to urban areas. About 6% report that some form of abuse took place in the month prior to their survey. The main perpetrators of abuse are from outside the family for elderly men and within the family for elderly women. And as part of the survey, the subjective well-being, functionality and healthcare utilization is also covered. The various indicators of physical and mental well-being shows a significant level of poor health among elderly, with a high proportion among oldest old, poor, illiterate and widows in this category. The analysis is on self-rated health. It also clearly shows that a maximum of 55% elderly rating their health as poor or fair on a 5-point scale. Thus, the self-rated health appears to be lower in comparison with that of the elderly population in developed countries. Over 5% of the elderly in the country have serious functionality issues with regard to basic functions necessitating regular care and support. The prevalence of locomotor limitations was much higher, with nearly half of the elderly having problems of vision. Nearly 2/3 of the elderly report suffering from at least one chronic ailment, with arthritis, hypertension, diabetes, asthma and heart disease as the most commonly reported ailments. Women have higher prevalence rates of chronic conditions than men on an average and are much more likely to suffer from these diseases. The majority of the elderly sought treatment from chronic ailments. Overall, nearly 10% of the elderly were hospitalized in the year prior to survey. Gender differentials in hospitalization also are visible, especially in urban areas. At the conclusion, we can say that given the profile of the elderly, it clearly depicts the extent of their vulnerability and marginalization, and it is also focuses our attention to what suitable programs and schemes are to be evolved to address these issues, especially for those who are further marginalized and vulnerable in our society, so that their quality of life can be addressed suitably.